O'Malley's a doctor. Got it. Grace O'Malley is a doctoral student in the Virginia Tech Department of Biological Sciences. She's going to talk about her work gathering and analyzing acoustic data to detect invasive species, including her work in Arizona, studying invasive bullfrogs and native Arizona tree frogs. O'Malley will also discuss invasive plant research she's doing in Blacksburg and the surrounding areas. She's a graduate of Allegheny College, where she studied the aquatic macroinvertebrate and fish communities of Pennsylvania creeks and wetlands. There, she developed a passion for science, communication, and outreach. She joined the MIMS lab at Virginia Tech as a research technician in 2020, and today is doing her doctoral work with Dr. Merrill Mims. Grace is involved with several groups on campus, including the Global Change Center and the Invasive Species Collaborative. And she's titled her talk, Acoustic Research Sounds, Invasive Species Alarm. Did I get that right, Grace?
Yeah, close enough.
Okay. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, we'll get this shared. The typical, can everyone see my screen okay? I think after years and years of Zoom, we'd get this all figured out, but I still somehow managed to, always have some sort of mistake. So
it's perfect.
Perfect. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, Barb, for that introduction. And thank you for having me. I'm super excited to chat with y'all and share a little bit about my research, not only what I do in Arizona, but then also some of my work that I do locally here. So today we're going to talk about the alarm is sounding, but are we listening? Acoustic data and the detection of invasive species. So before we get rolling, I just have a few thank yous. I want to shout out my collaborators and lab mates, and all of my various funding sources for funding this work and allowing me to pursue my degree and get to play outside for a living. It's pretty great. So we'll do a quick outline of today's talk. It's kind of in two parts here. First, I'll talk about the bioacoustic monitoring that I do of native and invasive species in Arizona. So a different desert, a little different than the Sahara, but hopefully I'll be able to convince you it's just as cool. And then I'll get into a little bit more of my work that I do locally here in the NRV, listening to invasive plants. Okay, so we'll start with this kind of case study in the American Southwest. And so first I want to share this infographic that I've come across.
Trash them.
So in many parts of the United States, bullfrogs have actually been introduced and are considered an invasive species. So back in the early 1900s, companies were promoting raising bullfrogs as a food source. And so they were introduced not only across the United States, but also across the globe. So here you can see their blue range or their native range shown in blue and their invasive range shown here in red. So I grew up on the East Coast, and so when I hear bullfrogs, I typically think summer. But it's kind of, it took me a while to wrap my head around the fact that something that is, native to me might be invasive elsewhere. And so bullfrogs have actually, with their introduction around the world, oh, come on, slide, there we go. No, why aren't my slides changing? There we go. Sorry about that. And so with this global introduction of bullfrogs, they've actually caused over $6 billion US dollars in damages. And that's including damages and also mitigation efforts. So they're not only a huge problem in the US, but also a huge global threat. And one of the reasons that they're so invasive, one, in their invasive range, they lack the natural predators that they have here in the East Coast. So they lack those fishes and bird predators. And they're also generalist species, so they can survive in a myriad of different habitats. And they're also what we call gape-limited predators. So you can see here different photos of bullfrogs eating other frogs, fishes. We've even got bullfrogs eating birds, snakes, and this is a picture of a bullfrog eating a bat. So they're really voracious predators. They will eat anything they can fit in their mouths, which is a really great trait of an invasive species. But since they're causing so much damage worldwide, and especially here in the US, there's an increasing need and want to control or eradicate these species. And so bullfrogs are presenting a major challenge in aquatic habitats, especially in the Western United States, where they've been purposefully introduced. And we're going to be focusing on the Southwest United States, specifically Southeastern Arizona, where the bullfrogs have been shown to be or have been implicated in many species declines, especially federally listed and state listed species. And so one of those threatened species is very near and dear to my heart. It's the Arizona tree frog. This is a tiny chorus frog that lives in 3 distinct populations, kind of the north to mid Arizona, the southeast Arizona right here on the Arizona-Mexico border, and then another population in Sonora, the Sonora, Mexico area. The population that I specifically study is right here in the Huachuca Mountains. And this group is genetically, geographically, and morphologically distinct from the other 2 groups, and it's also isolated from those 2 groups. And because of that genetic distinction as well as geographic isolation, this population was recently a candidate for federal protection. They were not listed under the Endangered Species Act, which is a good thing in that they didn't need listing, but also not a great thing because then they don't get the protections that the Endangered Species Act provides. But they are listed as a species of state conservation concern in the state of Arizona. So they do have some state level protections. And so here's a photo of the Huachuca Mountains and then the surrounding Canelo Hills. So this is the landscape that we work in. And this landscape is dotted with ponds all over, and rolling hills and even these mountains in the background. And there's a lot of heterogeneity in the habitat. And a lot of that is due to the seasonal patchy monsoons that the region experiences. So every summer around July 4th is the unofficial start date of the monsoon season. The rains pick up and they can be really patchy. So you can see this, I'm standing on a road taking this picture, watching it rain in the distance. So you can be somewhere and a mile away, it's pouring down rain. And so that creates a lot of variation in the habitat availability in the region. And so we get these large ponds that will hold water year round, and that's where the bullfrogs tend to live. Their tadpoles typically need a year, so they need to overwinter before they can metamorphose and leave the ponds. But the landscape is also dotted with these semi-permanent ponds that fill in the summer with that monsoon rain, but then dry down throughout the year. And so this is where we typically find our Arizona tree frogs. And these ponds harbor really unique communities because they don't have fish. And so because there is not that fish predator, we get a really unique community of amphibians and other aquatic macroinvertebrates that live in these ponds. However, climate change as well as human modifications to the region are altering these natural processes of whether or not the ponds have water and how often they dry and fill back up. So that's reducing the overall habitat for not only the Arizona tree frog, but also other amphibians throughout the region. And so we're thinking about our bullfrogs and tree frogs. Our lab has kind of taken on this big project to think about how do we conduct strategic removal and control of non-native species. Now, obviously, we're not going to talk about all of this today, but these are just a few areas that our lab thinks about investigating this problem. And my piece of the puzzle is kind of comes into the spatial information and the species interactions. And so I use bioacoustic monitoring to understand when and where our species of interest occur and where they overlap so that we can help inform invasive species control and eradication methods. So I'm sure, as I heard y'all talking about birds, you're very familiar with bioacoustics, but in case not, I just wanted to give a little precursor of what bioacoustics actually is. So it's the combination of biology and acoustics, so studying the production, transmission and reception of animal sounds. And we can harbor the unique vocalizations that species make to detect their presence and activity across a landscape. And we can do this passively by deploying our acoustic sensors to record and monitor our species activity, so we don't actually have to be there. And so, like I said, we can do continuous or potentially near continuous monitoring with these passive acoustic devices. So here are some images of some different ones. We have audio moths, or the Swift units from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, or these song meter minis from Wildlife Acoustics. And so with this passive acoustic monitoring, we really have unique opportunities to record species distributions and activity over spatial and temporal areas that's not feasible with traditional monitoring methods. So essentially, it's like putting a person at each site all day, every day, and listening for that species activity. Now, with this deployment of the passive acoustic monitoring, we actually collect a lot of data, which is a problem in and of itself, which we'll get to in a little bit. But because of that, we also record our non-target taxa that can be used for future analyses. So I have some collaborators at University of Texas at San Antonio, who are going to be taking our acoustic data to look at the bird communities present at these ponds. So passive acoustic monitoring, it's a really powerful tool, and it's become, as technology has advanced, it's become even more powerful over the past 10, 20 years. And so at these sites here, and because both tree frogs and bullfrogs have unique calls that are easy to distinguish from one another, we're able to put our passive acoustic recording devices at each pond to monitor for both species. And so we have a pond just like this one, where we place our acoustic monitoring device in a tree. We tried to hide them as best we could. However, since we work on Forest Service property, there is a lot of public interference, and we have had a few recorders go missing. But for the most part, they've lasted for 3 years now. We'll be going out for our 4th year to collect data next summer, or this upcoming summer, excuse me. So we set our recorders, we set our recording parameters to hopefully record both bullfrogs and tree frogs. And then we collect the data, we get a spectrogram like this, which again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, especially thinking about Merlin and eBird and calls. So this is what our tree frog call looks like. It's kind of these like short staccato kind of calls. And then we have our lower frequency bullfrog calls. And so hopefully this will play and you'll be able to get a little hear our tree frogs first and then the bullfrogs coming in. Did it play? I'm assuming it played. Awesome, cool. So yeah, so the tree frogs form these really dense calling aggregates, very similar to like a spring peeper chorus would be. And so they come out in the ponds of the hundreds and form these calling choruses, and they're calling, they can be real loud. Ooh, okay. And so with that, we sometimes I've found myself drowning in data. So for context, Where we work in Arizona, we have 50 different sites, all with a recorder, and they're programmed to record 12 hours a day for about 3 to 4 months out of the year, depending on the battery life. And so that creates about 5 terabytes of acoustic data every summer. And we redo this every summer. So I am currently sitting on over 15 terabytes of acoustic data, just within this project for my dissertation. And unfortunately, I do not have the time, and I don't think I could find and pay enough undergraduates to go through all that acoustic data and listen for all the calls. So we've had to move forward and use a software to build what's called a simple classifier. And so the software we use is from the same company that we have the recording devices from, so Wildlife Acoustics. Excuse me. And basically this clustering algorithm pairs like sounds with like sounds. And so you can feed it training data and parameterize different settings to get it to identify tree frogs and bullfrogs and separate them out from calls of other species. So I've trained this software to identify the calls of both of these species. But it's only so good as, how accurate we can get it. So before we can even use these simple classifiers to build our activity and occupancy data sets for both species, we have to figure out how accurate our simple classifier is, and also why that matters. So of course, the more accurate the simple classifier, the more reliable our results are going to be, which in general is just a better thing. However, these potential errors in detection, so the classifier potentially saying there's a bullfrog present when there's actually not, or vice versa, the classifier could miss a call, has different outcomes for different species. So for our tree frog, for example, our native species, because they call in these dense calling aggregates, we're most likely going to detect them at some point. And if we miss a day here and there, or falsely identify that the tree frog's at that site, that's not going to be very costly, because at the end of the day, we'll still know that they're there. However, it's a lot more costly to miss an invasive species like our bullfrogs. So when we get that, what's called a false negative detection, where our classifier tells us that there were no bullfrogs there, but they actually were there, that's a lot more costly, because then they could potentially establish at a site. So the simple classifier that we built was very accurate, with a caveat there. So we only had an 8% error rate of detection for tree frogs. So luckily the simple classifier, the software, only missed tree frogs about 8% of the time. And that is, even though it might seem kind of high, it's actually better than published results for other frog species of people who have done similar things. So I was really excited to get that 8%. And with that error rate, we can then incorporate that into our future detection models. So we have a detection probability, essentially. However, the error rate for our the bullfrogs was a bit higher at 23%. This is not too out of line of published results. So some of the highest results that I've seen published are around 20%. So obviously above that, but still not terrible. However, it's still not ideal. I want that rate to be a lot lower. And so I kind of dug into why we might be getting these high error rates, and mostly so that we can use what we learned from this process and share it with others, so that they can do the most effective data processing, and it can be applied to other native or invasive species monitoring programs. So after I did a little digging on what the heck was going on with these bullfrog calls, I found that there is one animal in the region that has a very similar call, at least on the spectrogram, to our bullfrog. So like I said, we work in on US Forest Service land, which is public land that is leased to ranchers in the area. So there's cattle grazing all throughout the region where we work. And come to find that a cow's moo sounds very, very similar to a bullfrog croak. And so one of these is a screenshot of the spectrogram from a cow mooing, and the other one is a bullfrog croak. Any guesses as to which is which? Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard to tell them apart. So the one on the left is actually our cow, and the one on the right is the bullfrog. And the reason that these are so difficult to tell apart, especially from the software's perspective, is that you can see both calls kind of have these multiple harmonics. They last about the same amount of time. They each last about a second. And their dominant frequency down at the bottom there is about the same. So statistically, when the software is looking at these calls, it has a really, really hard time telling them apart. However, we can go back in and manually listen to those identified calls to kind of double check, is it actually a bullfrog or is it a cow? And so luckily, we're still able to use our simple classifier to because being wrong 20% of the time and going back and manually verifying still saves us a ton of time compared to manually scanning all of that acoustic data. And so with that, I've been able to do some preliminary analysis into the activity of the bullfrogs and the tree frogs, both in this region. So here I have a map of our study site, and you can see the Forest Service boundary is in green, and all of those little gray dots are a site with a recorder. And here in blue in the middle is Parker Canyon Lake. So there is a reservoir that has been dammed and is maintained as a recreational lake in the region, and has a huge bullfrog population. It's kind of a hindrance to bullfrog management in the region. And so at one of these tanks, for example, this one called Collins, that was about 3.5 kilometers away, it was actually fully drained one summer. And so we know there were no bullfrogs there. And because we had an acoustic recorder there, we could actually monitor where or when and if the bullfrogs recolonized the site after the pond was drained and they were all removed. So here you can see that site that was actually pumped. So we pumped the water out of it with the goal of removing a habitat for bullfrogs. And here you can see in June, it was completely dry, no bullfrogs present. But then here in August, after those monsoon rains came through, the pond filled back up again. And so with the acoustic recording, we can actually tell what day bullfrogs likely recolonized. So it is possible that they colonized a different earlier and they just weren't calling. But we assume that it was still within a week that they colonized and then started calling. So here you can see at these other two sites called Bill Woods and Down Under. These two sites were not drained. And so bullfrogs started calling at the start of the monsoon season. So this is each day in July here in the red, we have our bullfrogs calling. But here at Collins Tank, we know exactly when they started calling here at the end of August, or excuse me, end of July. And we wouldn't have been able to determine with that level of accuracy when they recolonized the sites without this acoustic monitoring. And same for the tree frogs, we were able to look at their when they started calling and when they started their activity. So here's two different sites. We have one called Becker's Folly and one called Pauline Well. And the consecutive days here that are marked, that's when they really start chorusing. So we had one day where one male must have been confused. He got there a little too early, started calling, but realized there were no ladies present yet. And so the chorus kind of kicked off later, but there's about a 17-day difference here in between when both tree frogs started calling. So again, this is really preliminary data. I am really excited to start investigating the drivers of why the start time of breeding is so different between these frogs in such a small area. It could just be due to the patchiness of the monsoon season and the ponds filling up. But I'm super excited to get into this and then use this occupancy and activity data in some models in the future. And so just kind of wrapping up our journey in Arizona, some main takeaways is acoustic monitoring is very effective, but that effectiveness is context dependent. So for example, where we have our bullfrogs overlapping with cows that make a very similar noise, the acoustic monitoring is not going to be as effective, but it is very effective when you have, for example, the tree frogs, when there are not animals that make a similar sound. And with that acoustic monitoring, we can also gain insight into the colonization dynamics of invasive species that we may have previously missed without the ability or without passive acoustic monitoring. And so I'm really excited, again, to kind of dig into this a little bit more, and then also take what we learn from learning about the occupancy and activity dynamics of both the native and invasive species, and how we can apply that on a broader sense to potentially other desert or invasive species or invasive species in the US in general. So now we're going to come back to the East Coast, and I'll talk a little bit about the work that I've been doing here locally in the Blacksburg area, thinking about soundscapes and their silent invaders. And so we'll go back to the bullfrogs real quickly. Like I said, throughout my dissertation, I've used acoustics, to study species and species specifically and their activity and distributions and such. But as I was digging into the literature and reading about bullfrogs, I came across this paper that talked about how the bullfrog calls with their loud, booming, droning calls might be, impacting native species calls and the soundscape as a whole. And so I really started thinking about trying to take a step back, and instead of thinking about species specific noises, thinking about the soundscape as a whole, and this additional axis in which invasive species might be either causing problems or a different way that we can think about monitoring invasive species. And so I just wanted to throw this figure up to talk about a soundscape. So soundscapes are the way that we think about sound in ecosystems. And so thinking about not only the noise produced by different species, but also noise coming from human systems, noise coming from weather events such as wind and rain, and how all these interact together. So no longer thinking about species-specific sounds, but thinking about sounds from the ecosystem as a whole. And so I started, thinking about these soundscapes and how invasive species, especially the bullfrog that makes sound, might be impacting these soundscapes. But then I started thinking about, what about invasive species that don't make noise? So for example, plants. And I was in a group with Dr. Jacob Barney, who is a professor in the School of Plant Sciences, and he thinks a lot about invasive plants. And we started talking and had this kind of crazy idea to investigate invasive plants and how they might be altering soundscapes. And so with Dr. Barney, my advisor, Dr. Merrill Mims, a postdoc in my lab, Dr. Joseph Drake, and a multimedia expert, David Franisich, who works at ICAT at Virginia Tech, we came together to do this kind of art science collaboration to think about, what does an invaded ecosystem sound like? And so what we wanted to do is kind of recreate these soundscapes and compare them between invaded and non-invaded systems. And so we actually created this installation at the Cube at the Moss Arts Center, where we created this multi-sensory experience of listening to invaded landscapes. And we did this thinking about the bullfrogs in Arizona, while also thinking about invasive plants here in the NRV. And so hopefully this will play, but I have a short video that will kind of hopefully give you the immersive experience and give you an inside look at what we did. And that's playing. If it's not, let me know. Awesome. So through creating this immersive experience, thinking about one, how bullfrogs, who are an animal that creates sound, might change the soundscape, but then also thinking about invasive plants and how they might be altering the soundscape. We collected some preliminary data, and we started to notice some interesting trends that we wanted to investigate further. And so with that, our team came together and kind of and wrote and published actually this kind of thought piece, kind of as a call to action, thinking about how invasive plants might be altering soundscapes and this kind of underappreciated axis of diversity that we're missing when we're not thinking about soundscapes. And so talking about the different, or we proposed different mechanisms by which the plants could alter soundscapes. So either reducing or increasing the abundance of sound-making species, altering the behavior of sound-making species, or also changing the physical environment. So if you can think about walls of kudzu and how that might impact the sound that transmits through an ecosystem. And so after we went through this, we wrapped up our science art installation. We pursued some seed funding through the Global Change Center here at Virginia Tech to really dig into this problem and asking, can invasive plants actually alter our soundscapes? So this has become an additional chapter of my dissertation. And if you would have asked me a couple of years ago when I was first starting out, if I would have a chapter looking at invasive plants and soundscapes, I would have told you you're crazy. But I've really dove headfirst into this world, and I'm super excited about it. So really excited to share what we've been up to. So for this study, we chose two different invasive plants. We chose autumn olive and Japanese stiltgrass because both of these plants are very prevalent around the New River Valley, easy to access, and they also serve two different ecological roles. So for example, autumn olive, it's a shrubby plant that typically invades open pastures like we have here. it was originally introduced to help stabilize the soil because its root system is really deep and it can grow really fast. And so we chose to look at autumn olive because we predicted that it would potentially increase diversity metrics within our soundscape because it adds structure and habitat to a previously opened area, so would potentially attract species for the habitat, but then also it produces these berries that birds love to eat. So we were hypothesizing that in areas where we have this autumn olive, that it would potentially be louder, more diverse. We'd hear more bird species, more insect species. And then the opposite with Japanese stiltgrass. So stiltgrass is a grass that invades mostly forested areas and can homogenize the forest floor community, taking it from a diverse mixture of different grasses and ferns and other shrubs and changing it into this kind of monoculture of grass. And stiltgrass was accidentally introduced, likely in packing material from Asia. And with stiltgrass, we're predicting decreases in our diversity metrics and species counts. One reason is that an earlier study done about 10 years ago found that in areas with stiltgrass, there were reduced American toad populations. And that was because the stiltgrass actually provided more habitat for spiders to prey on these toads. So these two different species, really distinct, serve different ecological roles. We wanted to investigate how they might be altering the soundscapes. And unfortunately, both of these species are well established and there are limited management options for both species. So for those of you who are not familiar with either of these species, I just wanted to shout out a few ways to potentially manage them. Because I know the Master Naturalist group also interacts a lot with the public, and so wanted to arm you with some potential information. So the most effective way to manage our autumn olive is by physical removal. So and then treat the stumps with herbicide. If you have been to Heritage Park recently by the Gateway Trail, the town of Blacksburg has actually gotten a grant to remove a whole bunch of autumn olive. And so they go in with wood choppers and just get rid of it all. Fortunately, you can eat or cook with the berries from the autumn olive. So I am very excited to go out this summer and collect a whole bunch of autumn olives and make some autumn olive jam. I found a recipe for some autumn olive barbecue sauce. And by collecting and removing those berries, it prevents dispersal by species and can help prevent the spread of autumn olive. And then we've got our Japanese stiltgrass on the other hand. And unfortunately, the best way to control stiltgrass is by actually doing physical removal, especially before the seed heads emerge, so that they can't disperse, and then also treating the area with herbicide. So both species are well established and currently do not have super effective management besides physical removal and herbicide, unfortunately. And so, yeah, again, like I said, we chose to investigate both of these species because they're very prevalent in the NRV. So here is a map of our study system locally. So we can see where we have Heritage Park here, Pandapis Pond. And so the yellow represents the stiltgrass sites and the red represents the autumn olive sites. And so we deployed these passive acoustic recorders at each of these sites, and they record the first 5 minutes of every hour. And we did that just to manage the amount of data that we would be collecting. And it's doing so every day for 1 whole year. So we're really excited. This study should collect about 4 terabytes of data. So a little bit more manageable than the work, in Arizona. And because they'll be out for a whole calendar year, we'll be able to look at seasonal differences. And so at each of these sites, we have paired sites. So one that is invaded and one is non-invaded, kind of as our control. So for example, here we would find a dense wall of autumn olive and place the recorder as far as we could into the center so that it's hidden from, looky-loos, passerbys. And then we found our control site, looked for more of an open field area. So for example, this is down at the Stream Lab that Virginia Tech runs, and tried to find an area with as little other invasive plants, and an area that mocked an open field, which is where the autumn olive typically invades. So this would be a representation of our control site. And then for stiltgrass, we did similar things. We found areas where there was very high densities of stiltgrass, placed our recorder, and then other areas in the forest where there was no stiltgrass and native, or as native as possible, ground cover. Unfortunately, it's very hard to find sites that are completely uninvaded. And so the big question kind of is, before we, as I was getting into this, how do we actually turn our acoustic data, these recordings, into usable ecological data? Because we're not thinking about individual species, we're thinking about the soundscape as a whole. And so luckily for us, there's a way to do this using something called acoustic indices. And so we're able to use the same software that I use for building the cluster analyses and the simple classifier to calculate these acoustic indices. And basically, the software kind of condenses these acoustic recordings into numerical descriptors of the patterns and the distribution of acoustic energy and sounds in an audio recording. And so we're using 3 acoustic indices to analyze our data. And so those 3 are the acoustic complexity index, which essentially, quantifies how complex the soundscape is. So you can think about a soundscape with a lot of birds chorusing. You have a lot of different variation versus a cicada chorus, which might be one long drone. A cicada chorus is going to be much less complex than a bird chorus. And we also have the acoustic diversity index, which essentially just calculates how diverse the soundscape is. So a higher value, more diversity, which potentially means more species present. And then also this acoustic evenness index. It's an inverse to diversity. A higher number would represent dominance in one frequency band. So for example, going back to our cicadas, where we might have one long drone, that's going to be a really uneven recording because most of the sound and the energy is concentrated in one frequency band, versus a bird chorus where we have sound distributed across many frequency bands. And so by using these multiple indices, we can gain insight into the soundscape and make comparisons between our invaded and uninvaded sites, and gain insight into whether they might be more or less diverse than one another. And so we deployed these recorders, like I said, and then I go out about once a month to check the batteries, collect the SD cards, and then I can run that through that software, and it's really nice. It just spits out an Excel file for me and calculates each index for me. And so now I have these raw numbers, or not raw numbers, but these numbers to then compare to one another between sites. And so because this study is currently ongoing, I've only been able to analyze a few months of data, and I've only actually been able to look at the stiltgrass sites. But we're finding some really exciting results that our invaded sites do actually sound different than our control sites. So for the stiltgrass sites, for example, they're less diverse, which is what we hypothesized, which is really exciting. And so I went back and looked at some of our photos of these sites to kind of, see what we're working with. And especially in this site here on the right, you can see the stiltgrass is extremely, extremely dense. And then we have similar ground cover, or not less dense ground cover and different species on the right in this control site. But you can see here in this site, the stiltgrass is not as dense as it is in this other site. So over the summer, I'm going to be going out and doing some plant surveys to actually quantify the density of our invaded plants and quantify the ground cover in invaded and control sites for stiltgrass. And then also same for the autumn olive sites. Look at the different species present and quantify the densities to account for any think that that could be contributing to our results. So super exciting results already that our invaded soundscapes are looking a little bit different than our control soundscapes. So just kind of a main takeaway from the work here we're doing locally, soundscape analysis can be used to track whole ecosystem changes, and we're seeing that in real time, especially as we transition from the fall to winter to spring. Really excited to look at how those acoustic indices and the diversity changes over time. And we're also seeing that invasive plants can be altering the soundscape through a variety of different mechanisms, like I talked about, potentially attracting different species or repelling different species, or also altering the physical environment through which sound travels. So again, this is really really preliminary, but already getting some exciting results. And I'm really looking forward to digging into this further. So if there's one thing at all that I want you to take away from today, is that sound is a very fundamental but often underappreciated and understudied component of our natural world. And there's, this whole axis of biodiversity that we're potentially not accounting for by not analyzing soundscapes. And so thinking about soundscapes and acoustics, we can use it, to analyze single species or just communities, or even whole ecosystems. And with that, I will take any questions. Also, stop sharing. There we go.
So I guess we've got one question in the chat.
Yeah.
I'm curious from, oops, went away. Reagan asks, I'm curious if you have considered using models other than clustering algorithms on your frog data. Do you currently do any pre-processing, filtering, etc. of your data before clustering?
Yeah, great questions. So we currently do not do any pre-processing for the frog algorithms. Because we found that if we try to do any sort of filtering, our error rate of detection increases. Especially with the cows, I've tried to do some filtering where, I tell the software to only look for, this dominant frequency band or a call that lasts X amount of seconds. But the cow and the bullfrog calls are just so similar. There is potential to, I haven't investigated it yet, but I do plan to do some filtering when looking at the soundscapes. So some of our sites, unfortunately, are kind of close to roads and get some traffic noise. And so I do plan to filter that out to and compare before filtering, after filtering, to see if it makes a difference. As far as different models and clustering algorithms, I first started this work about 3 years ago. And since I've started it, technology has definitely advanced, and there are other models and algorithms to process acoustic data. However, those are more geared towards finding rare sounds. And our tree frogs and bullfrogs are definitely not rare. So moving to those kind of more complex algorithms and models are almost overkill for what we need. And so it's been an interesting balancing act of trying to figure out what, amount of computing power and, coding and actual data analysis I need to do to get at the questions that I'm interested in. So I've decided not to kind of investigate some of those additional models because they are geared more towards those rare sounds, and they're just a little too powerful for what I need. Also, I am a very computers and coding and technologies is still very scary to me. I'm a field ecologist through and through. I would so much rather be outside than in front of my computer. So it's been a challenge to dive into these softwares and become familiar with them for sure. I see another question in the chat. The original reason for introducing bullfrogs into the West. So in Arizona specifically, Arizona Game and Fish introduced the bullfrogs as a food source. So as the West was being developed, especially with cattle ranchers, the thought was that bullfrogs would be a hardy animal that could survive in these constructed waters that they constructed for cattle. And so the thought was, oh, we'll put bullfrogs in the water, and they'll also be a food source for the cowboys that are out with the cattle. And they're also introduced for gain for hunting as well. But the main reason was it was a food source. However, it did not take off as a popular food, and the bullfrogs were able to just run rampant and go where they please.
I think that looks like all the questions. I wish we could see the performance that was in the cube that happened last April.
Yeah.
Oh, I was all ready to go. Oh boy, put that on my calendar. I don't remember when that happened.
Oh yeah, I should have noted that was last April. I'm so sorry.
Oh, I'm sure everybody knew but me, so it's fine. It would be fun. Too bad I suppose it's too complicated to arrange something like that, is it?
Yeah, it took our audiovisual expert, David, it took him about, it was probably a good 3-4 days to set up and get all the screens working and the directional speakers. But I think, and I don't remember if this is happening this summer, but ICAT, the Institute for Creative Arts and Technology that funded that immersive experience, wants to turn that into kind of a traveling show. And I think it's going to be displayed at a gallery in DC, I believe, next summer, this summer or next summer. So there is some version that's going on the road, and will hopefully be potentially revived at some point in the cube.
Thank you. Are you there, Chris?
I am here. Thank you so much for that presentation. That was really interesting. And I did not see a notice for the ICAT performance, so I'm sorry that I missed that.
That's okay. It was, I think it was only up for 2 days, unfortunately. So it's a very limited window.
Really interesting. I look forward to hearing more about that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yay,
Well,
Grace.
well, thank you so much for having me. And again, I'm happy to take any other questions. Please feel free to reach out to Barb if you would like my email. I'm always happy to chat. Anything bullfrogs, Arizona, soundscapes.
Thanks,
Great.
Grace.
Yeah.
Thanks again. We're going to move on to the business portion of our meeting. We're not kicking you out, but I can imagine you're probably not terribly interested in that.
That's going back to my dog, I hear her begging for dinner. So
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thanks, you too.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, everyone. Thank you so much. I know everybody's got a lot of demands on their time, so I appreciate your being here this evening. Not a whole lot of business to cover, but one of the things that we have going on is we've been doing a lot of library presentations on different topics, and the libraries are really enthusiastic about having us do those presentations. So if any of you have a topic that you would like to develop to take to the libraries, very often you're presenting to kids, so your audience would be really enthusiastic, and the libraries are very supportive. So let us know if you're interested in doing something like that. You wouldn't be doing it on your own. Normally, we go kind of as a team so that you're not there all on your lonesome and feeling isolated. So please let us know if you're interested in doing that. We really need people to step up. I think Mara is still on it. Mara and Reinhardt are still away. But we haven't gotten a whole lot of response for people stepping up to fill in the positions that are going to be vacated soon. And this organization can't continue to function unless we have people that are willing to serve in an administrative capacity. So even if you don't feel qualified, I suspect most of us, when we stepped into, like me, stepped into their current positions, felt that way at one time or another. And you get a lot of support, and it's a great experience, a great learning experience. So please contact us and let us know if you're willing to serve in any of those capacities. We would really appreciate it.
Well, Chris, if I could just say about the vice president position, which ends for me next May, our committee is really, really good, and we share the load extremely well. So we've already got things in place for the most part for our chapter meetings and a few functions all the way through December. So whoever is willing to take over the lead, basically you're just sort of keeping things organized and meeting with the committee a few well, I guess we meet about 4 times a year is all, and most of the rest of the time we talk other ways. We don't always meet face to face. And we come up with people with topics that sound interesting and simply make the arrangements. We've divided it up, and it's if anyone on my committee, I know just about everybody sitting out there. I don't think any of us feel overworked, do we? Uh-oh, maybe we do.
I think everybody's muted.
Yeah. Well, they know how to
Otherwise, they
unmute.
would be clamoring to respond.
But it's really been interesting to connect with people who know so much about different topics and to just sort of look for opportunities, because just reading the newspaper, the tech email, there's so many ways that ideas cross your path. It's not like you have to start with anything other than just start being aware of looking for options and opportunities. So I hope somebody call me if you're interested at all, because it's been fun. I've done it long enough, but it's been fun, and I'm not going to leave the committee. So we just would be adding one more person. Anybody have questions about that? Yeah, the main job really is sort of keeping track of these kinds of activities for us, and speakers, presenters, things like that. Oh, and also, since I'm talking, next month is our chapter meeting will be on May 19th on Sunday at Nelly's Cave Park, where we'll have our annual meeting and an election to replace the vice president and secretary, and a potluck on that day. We have the shelter rented from 4 to 8, so somewhere in there we'll pick a time and eat. So I hope everyone can make it.
Great, thank you. I was out at Claytor Lake with Judy and Mac, talking to them about upcoming schedules and things that they would like some help with. One of the things was maybe a Mother's Day walk that would be on the 12th. Could be flowers, insects, any kind of plants, whatever kind of topic you're interested in. You would just be taking a walk with people that show up for that particular activity, and just pointing things out to them, explaining things, answering questions. It would be something very easy to do. So if you have an interest in that, please let Judy know. Unfortunately, Judy and Matt couldn't be here this evening, but I think you have her contact information, so let her know. Also having to do with the park, if you haven't already, please put your information in for the background check. That process, because of state staffing problems, is taking a long time. And if you ever plan to help out with any of the activities at Claytor Lake, you have to have that background check done. So please put that information in as soon as possible if you're at all interested in ever doing any of those things. I think that's about all that I have for this evening. Did anybody have any questions?
How is the Bear project going? Did it get manned for the Seeds Festival and some of the other dates that are on the schedule? Carol must be gone too.
Yeah, Carol's not here. Seeds is covered. I don't think it would hurt anybody's feelings if extra people showed up. I'm sure we could use them, but we've got the minimum staffing for that. So that part of the Bear table is okay.
And we had great success with showing it at the library. We had a good turnout. And unfortunately, there was one source that gave the wrong timing. So there were people that came in too late and missed it. But it was a very good presentation and it was well attended.
That's good to hear. Thank you.
I've had my first bear here.
Did
It
you-
crawled over the fence. Yep, the bears are around. They've started making their presence.
I had one on my deck the other night.
Oh, boy.
We could still use people to sign up for monitoring the bluebird trails at the high school and the elementary school and middle school. That's Sign Up Genius. You should have gotten that if you're on the list. Brenda Graff sent that out. You can contact me if you have questions about that. A few things about project committee, because I'd like to give that up, and I've mentioned that before. Tanya Moxley is now doing the weekly calendar. So she sent out information on where to send any things that you want to get listed on that calendar. I don't have it right in front of me, but she sent an email to all the members about where to send any information about events. Heading up the project committee, we generally meet by Zoom, and we don't have a set number of times we meet. But basically, our job right now is to approve continuing ed and help people get new projects started. We don't man them, but we give them the tools to fill out the project proposal, which is not very complicated, and then look at it and approve it if it would be a good project for our chapter. And then to try to get people to participate. You know, when you think you have 100 or 120 members, but we have quite a few different projects going, it doesn't always give us a good number of people for any one particular project. So it's to try to get people, our project committee is to try to get people enthusiastic about the projects, let them know what's happening, and some of the communication with the project, with the chapter. Communication in the chapter, really between social media and Better Impact and emails. There's a lot of different, and YouTube and website. There are a lot of different communication venues, and they're not all under the project committee. But let me know if you're interested and want more information about that. We're meeting this week, and I think what we'll be working on is a way for you to, when you're just doing a project that's not an outreach project, but say you're out monitoring bluebirds and somebody stops you and asks you what you're doing, and you give them a 10-minute explanation about why we have a bluebird trail, you'll have an opportunity to start noting contacts, direct or indirect contacts with all of the activities. So that's coming on Better Impact. And And then we'll probably be reviewing, since in December, before Brenda does the report, she looks at everybody's hours. We'll probably just be refining, pointing out any errors that people in general are not getting straight. So we'll be looking at that, any errors that we've been making and recording our hours, and send an email out or talk about it at a meeting so they can be more accurate in the future. That's it.
Having to do with projects, I want to remind people that we do have signs that say Master Naturalists at Work. And if you know that you're going to be out doing something in public, not necessarily a presentation, but something like checking the bluebird boxes. If you want to use one of those signs, we'd be glad to get that to you. And that would attract attention from the public, and it might spark some questions that you can interact with them about. I think that's about all I have. I was hoping that Tanya would be here because she did an excellent job of keeping our communications going in the last month with all the challenges with email, with Sandy being gone. Welcome back, Sandy. We're very happy you're back here. She's done a really, really good job of keeping everybody in the loop, and we appreciate that. No one has anything else. Are there any other committees that would like to check in? I think Reinhardt is still away, so we don't have a treasurer's report. So I think that's it for the evening. So unless people have questions, we'll say
Thanks, Chris.
goodbye. You're welcome.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.